In the sweltering summer of 336 BCE, the kingdom of Macedon was shaken, not by war, but by whispering rumors and the clinking of goblets at a royal feast. Philip II, the iron-fisted king with a soft spot for weddings and power plays, had just celebrated the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra. Not that Cleopatra. She comes later in history and has better PR. Spirits were high, wine was flowing like the Aegean tide, and everyone was having a grand old time. Until Philip was suddenly, and quite rudely, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. It was like a scene out of an ancient soap opera, only bloodier. The assassination left a power vacuum wider than the Hellespont, and into that breach stepped his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Not content with just wearing the crown, Alexander wanted the world, or at least as much of it as his horse Bucephalus could gallop across. And so began one of the most ambitious, brilliant, and utterly bananas military campaigns in history. Alexander wasn't just a young man with daddy issues and a really good sword. He'd been tutored by Aristotle himself. Yes, that Aristotle, who filled his students' mind with ideas about glory, virtue, and probably a bunch of philosophy stuff that Alexander promptly ignored.
Teacher, I realized something.
Oh, and what did you understand, my inquisitive young man?
If you run fast, you won't catch up with the philosophy lesson.
Interesting logic. Wait. Hey, stop! Well, at least his mind moves no worse than his legs.
The moment he was crowned, Alexander's enemies underestimated him. That was their first mistake. The Greek city-states, always eager to test a new king's patience, started muttering about independence. Thebes was the loudest, so Alexander decided to make an example of them. He marched his army straight into Thebes, smashed its walls, razed it to the ground, and sold thousands of its people into slavery. The message was clear. Alexander was not here to play hoplite games. Once Greece was firmly under his sandal, Alexander turned his gaze eastward, to Persia, the mighty empire that had once humiliated the Greeks under Xerxes. Alexander declared that he would liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor and take revenge for past wrongs. The truth, however, was that he wanted glory, riches, and the biggest empire the world had ever seen. Also, it didn't hurt that Persia was sitting on mountains of gold and silk. Like any good conqueror, Alexander was half philosopher, half looter. In 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with about 40,000 soldiers, more ambition than food, and one enormous dream. At Troy, he paid tribute to Achilles by staging a little cosplay at the tomb of his ancient hero, then marched on to his first real challenge, the Battle of the Granicus River. The Persians, confused about why a 20-something was trying to invade their empire, lined up their cavalry along the banks. Alexander did what any normal general would not.
I will go home.
Me too.
Alexander?
I will charge uphill across the river.
Stupid.
He charged uphill, across a river, into waiting cavalry. Tactically questionable? Yes. Successful? Also yes. He nearly died, but his troops, inspired by their commander's bravery and probably high on adrenaline, won the day. The first domino fell. One by one, cities along the western Persian frontier capitulated, and Alexander made a show of mercy, unless the city resisted, in which case he made a show of turning it into ash. It was diplomacy with a side to arson. Then came the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, where he finally met Darius III, King of Kings, in person. Well, almost. Darius had a much larger army, but Alexander had a tighter formation and a lot more confidence. He drove a wedge through the Persian center and sent Darius running for the hills, literally. The Persian king fled so quickly, he left behind his family, treasure, and, most tragically, his dignity. Alexander, ever the gentleman, or the PR genius, treated Darius's family with respect. He even promised to marry Darius's daughter. But Alexander wasn't done, not by a long shot. After the Battle of Issus, with Darius fleeing like a startled gazelle, Alexander had a choice: chase the Persian king immediately or secure the cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Being both a strategist and a drama enthusiast, he chose the latter. These cities included some of the wealthiest in the empire, Phoenician ports like Tyre, Sidon, and Gaza, each a prize worth sieging if necessary. And siege he did. The city of Tyre, an island fortress just off the coast, looked at Alexander and said, "Good luck." Alexander looked back and said, "I don't need luck. I have engineers." For 7 grueling months, he besieged the city, building a massive causeway across the sea, essentially inventing land where there wasn't any. The Tyrians, unimpressed, mocked the construction, shot arrows, and even sent divers to sabotage it. Big mistake. When the walls finally fell, Alexander's army poured in with the fury of every man who's ever spent half a year dragging rocks into the ocean. The city was taken, its population punished, and the message to other cities was clear: resist, and you'll become a footnote in my autobiography. Gaza followed next. Its defenders, perhaps hoping for mercy, held out fiercely. Alexander, wounded in the fighting, was not in a merciful mood. Once he took the city, he had its commander dragged behind a chariot, because Alexander, like any good classicist, knew how to quote Achilles. Now came Egypt. When Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was greeted not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians, who were not overly fond of their Persian overlords, welcomed him with flowers, feasts, and flattering hieroglyphs. He responded by founding the city of Alexandria, which was essentially his way of saying, "You'll be hearing a lot more of me." At the oasis of Siwa, deep in the desert, he visited the oracle of Amun. The priests, perhaps sensing an opportunity to flatter a man who wielded both sword and ego with deadly precision. "Oki, Alexander is here. What should we do with this?"
Let's gather an army.
"Cool. And he is beating you."
Maybe we should just run away.
"Cool. And we don't have a home."
Let's make him the son of Zeus?
Amazing.
From then on, he wasn't just a king, he was a god king, which is, admittedly, a pretty great promotion for a guy who still hadn't hit 25. By now, Darius had regrouped. He offered Alexander a generous peace deal.
Hey, Alexander. I am ready to give you a part of my territories, some treasures. You can even officially marry into our family.
Cool. I don't agree. I conquer.
In 331 BCE, the two armies met again at Gaugamela, near modern-day Iraq. Darius had the advantage in numbers. He even brought war elephants, exotic, terrifying beasts that made a lot of noise and did very little else. Alexander's army was smaller, but far more disciplined. The Macedonian phalanx moved like a machine, and Alexander once again led the decisive cavalry charge that shattered the Persian line. Darius, in what was becoming a personal tradition, fled once more. This time, Alexander chased him. As Alexander marched through Persia, cities opened their gates to him. Babylon welcomed him like a hero. Susa surrendered without a fight. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, was a different story. Alexander entered Persepolis and stared in awe at its grandeur. Then, in a moment historians still argue about, he set it on fire. Either way, the flames consumed centuries of Persian heritage, while Alexander watched with a cup of wine and the blank look of a man realizing he may have gone a bit too far. By 330 BCE, Darius was dead, not at Alexander's hand, but murdered by his own satraps. When Alexander found the body, he gave Darius a royal burial and hunted down his killers with the righteous fury of a man who hated being robbed of dramatic closure. With the last Achaemenid ruler gone, Alexander declared himself the king of Asia. But Asia, as it turned out, was enormous. Alexander wasn't content with inheriting Darius's lands. No, he wanted to reach the end of the known world. He marched east through scorching deserts, frozen mountain passes, and regions so remote even the gods probably needed a map. In Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan, he faced fierce resistance, ambushes, and terrain that mocked every campaign manual ever written. It was here that he met Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. She was beautiful, clever, and politically useful. Alexander fell in love, or at least in alliance, and married her. Then came India. In 326 BCE, Alexander crossed the Indus River and entered a world filled with strange animals, bizarre customs, and warrior kings with names like Porus, who was 7 feet tall and rode elephants into battle like a man who didn't care for subtlety. At the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander faced his greatest test. The Indian army was massive, the elephants thunderous, and the weather dreadful. Alexander, now a master of improvisation, used terrain, timing, and pure tactical brilliance to defeat Porus, though not without heavy losses. Alexander, perhaps a bit flustered by the confidence, agreed and let him keep his territory. But Alexander's men had had enough. They were tired, homesick, and not entirely convinced that another 1,000-mile march to find the edge of the world was worth it. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, they mutinied. Even the greatest of leaders needs followers, and Alexander, realizing he had pushed them too far, turned back. The return journey was hellish. Instead of retracing his steps, Alexander chose to lead his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a place where even camels got depressed. Thousands perished. It was the worst logistical decision he ever made, but perhaps the most revealing. For all his genius, Alexander was still a mortal man, full of pride and hubris. By the time he returned to Babylon in 324 BCE, Alexander was 31. He had conquered more than anyone in history, founded dozens of cities, and ruled over millions. But his dream of unifying East and West, of blending cultures, armies, and gods was only beginning. He started wearing Persian robes, demanded divine honors, and encouraged intermarriage between his soldiers and local women. In 323 BCE, just as he was planning a campaign into Arabia, Alexander fell ill. Fever racked his body. His generals stood by helplessly. He lingered for days, growing weaker. When asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered, "To the strongest." Those words, Alexander the Great, king, conqueror, visionary, egomaniac, died in Babylon. His empire, stretched from Greece to the Indus, did not survive him. His generals carved it up like scavengers at a royal buffet. But his legacy? That endured. He changed the world's map, spread Greek culture across continents, and inspired everyone from Caesar to Napoleon. And somewhere in the dust of forgotten battlefields and ruined cities, Bucephalus the horse probably got a statue too.
Thanks for your view.